To say the Victorian era was a little strange would be one of the greatest understatements of all time, and thankfully these strange practices did not make it into modern times. First up, we have the unfortunate job known as toshing. We've probably all seen at least one episode of Dirty Jobs. While there are some pretty terrible jobs on that show, it's only really taking into account professions that exist today. The reality is the Victorian era was filled with all sorts of terrible jobs that unsurprisingly did not stand the test of time. And one of those terrible jobs was a tosher. Deep below the streets of London, toshers would scavenge the city's sewage systems in search of buried treasures. See, times were tough for many people during the Victorian era, and this meant that they would pretty much do anything to make a living. As it turns out, some valuables would get lost in the sewage system from time to time, and toshers were the ones who would go looking for them. Even if it meant having to rummage through human feces, toshers would pretty much take anything that they thought they could sell at the market. Thankfully for everyone, this job has been left well in the past. Do you think you could have survived in the Victorian era though? Let us know in the comments below. Up next, photographing the dead. There are living people who don't like being in photos, so just imagine posing for a pic with a deceased body. It might be hard to wrap your head around this, but this was a fairly normal practice for many people in the Victorian era. It would usually be reserved for young people who never really got the chance to have their photo taken, and this was often seen as a tribute to them. Families of the deceased would dress them up in formal wear and surround them with different objects that they enjoyed while they were still alive. This was a way of symbolizing their favorite hobbies and activities in life. This was also around the same time that the first camera was invented, so it was definitely a bit of a fascination with the new technology. However, photographing the dead was and still is very creepy. It might have been seen as a nice tribute back in the day. There is a good reason why it was left in the past. After that, we have taxidermied hats. Look, hanging up stuffed animals on the wall of your home is already a little strange for many people, but wearing them on your head is just shocking. But it seems like people in the Victorian era had a real fascination with taking their stuffed animals on the go. Not only that, but they somehow managed to turn these animal carcasses into a new twisted form of fashion. Back in the Victorian era, everyone was trying to find ways to show off their wealth in front of the common folk. People were coming up with all sorts of bizarre ideas, and animal hats were one of the ways people could show off their exuberant styles. People would use everything from cats and large birds to create some of the freakiest hats in history. They would also make a point of finding colorful birds like blue jays to add an extra bit of flair, if you can even call it that. Smaller creatures like hummingbirds were also fastened to hand fans. It's pretty easy to see why this form of fashion does not exist anymore. Next up, the Halloween dating game. Yes, nowadays we live in a society where people choose their life partners by swiping left and right on an app, but it seems like the Victorian era had an even stranger practice. There were plenty of odd traditions when it came to matchmaking, but the strangest of the bunch only happened on Halloween night. Single women would gather around a fire and throw nuts into the pile of burning wood. Each nut was said to represent a potential life partner for the woman who was tossing it into the mix. While most nuts would obviously pop out of the fire, the ones that survived the heat would be regarded as eligible candidates for the woman's future husband. It was certainly an odd way to make such an important life decision, but it seems that many women enjoyed playing this game. But how many of them actually chose their husbands based on the results of the game is a real mystery. Up next, we have Leech Medicine. We're told that leeches are dangerous creatures who carry infections, but people in the Victorian era saw the creepy water worms as a way to treat serious infections. Both rich and poor people believed that leeches were an effective way to treat any diseases that contain deadly toxins. Doctors would place leeches all over a person's skin and have them suck on the person's blood. Now, the reason for this was because they believed that the leeches were sucking the poison out of a person's veins. While it would work on some occasions, other times it would just create even more problems for the patients, as the leeches were often carrying deadly infections of their own. On top of the terrible medical practice, people would often find work as leech catchers because they could sell the water creatures to doctors. Of course, this meant putting your bare skin in leech-infested waters, and this would cause a ton of problems for the leech catchers. Next on our list is grave robbing. This wasn't necessarily a common practice, but it was in fact a real job. Some people would often hire a special team of grave robbers to dig up bodies and steal any valuables off of their person. They would then take the valuables to the fixer, and everyone involved would split the profit from everything they managed to sell. And in the cases where there were no valuables to be found, the deceased bodies would be sold to hospitals and doctors who would use them to conduct various medical tests. The grave robbers would often refer to themselves as resurrectionists to try and give the profession a better look, but it didn't make it any less evil. It also kickstarted a huge crime spree once people realized that they could just cut out the middleman and eliminate people themselves. Grave robbing was frowned upon in the Victorian era, and thankfully for everyone's sake, it is still frowned upon today. After that, we have sin eaters. That might sound like the name of a horrific creature from a fictional tale, but sin eaters were actually granted an incredibly disturbing job during the Victorian era. In certain cases, when a person would pass away, families of the deceased would hire a person known as a sin eater to enjoy a meal at their home. It sounds like a pretty easy way to make some quick cash and doesn't sound too strange until you realize that the chest of the deceased family member must be used as the table. That's right, people in the Victorian era wouldn't just pose with dead bodies and photos, they would also use them as dining tables. Some people believe that the food would absorb any sins that the deceased had committed during their lifetime. This would seemingly help them make it into heaven. However, that also means that the person eating the food would then take on all of the sins as their own and would have to carry them around forever. Next up is the safety bell coffin. This is one of the most bizarre inventions of all time, but one that was clearly necessary for the time period. Life expectancy during the Victorian era was considerably lower than it is today. There were many deadly diseases, and people weren't necessarily doing themselves any favors with their diets and non-existent exercise plans. But because death was so common during the Victorian era, many people would often be buried alive by accident. So to put a stop to these unfortunate premature burials, people invented the safety coffins that were fitted with a small bell attached to a piece of string. If someone woke up from their long slumber and realized that they were stuck underground in a wooden box, it would ring the bell to alert the authorities that they were in fact still alive. Now, thankfully, with the technology we have nowadays, it's virtually impossible to mistake a living person for the deceased. That also means that safety bell coffins are no longer necessary. Up next, we have the wife market. Yes, this is exactly how it sounds, and it should be pretty obvious why this does not exist anymore. A man selling his wife on the open market was not a rare sight in the Victorian era, and was almost always done with the wife's full consent. See, back in the day, most people could not afford the expensive legal fees that were required to go through an actual divorce. But rather than the couple just toughing it out and sorting out their differences, they would often agree for the husband to sell the wife to the highest bidder. People were doing pretty much anything they could to scrape some money together during the Victorian era, and the wife sales were through the roof. Now, aside from the fact that selling a human being is just a terrible practice, some men were actually getting married with the sole intention of reselling their wives for a profit. So yeah, it shouldn't be too hard to figure out why this practice does not exist in the modern era. And finally, we have toxic food. It's a mystery why anyone would willingly eat poison, but it seems like people in the Victorian era had no idea what they were doing to their bodies. People were very concerned about the overall appearance and taste of their food, and they would go to extreme lengths to make sure everything was perfect. It was common practice for bakers to strive for the whitest bread possible, and they would use some unconventional methods to achieve their goals. One common ingredient in bread was chalk, as it supposedly brought out the fluffy white texture that everyone desired. Another brutal idea was adding lead to certain foods because apparently it added a unique taste. As far as adding copper and mercury to jams and candies because it added a splash of color and made it more attractive to buyers. Unsurprisingly, all of these dangerous additives made a large bulk of the food extremely dangerous and played a huge part in the shorter life expectancies. And that wraps up our look at the 10 Victorian era customs that make no sense today. Let us know which one you thought was the weirdest of the bunch. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more videos.